This is Unit 3.3, Survivorship Curves. So survivorship curve is a way of graphing what we'll call patterns of mortality. So we did see this earlier in the biodiversity unit. Um, but what we're graphing here on one side on the vertical axis is the number of survivors. And this is listed as a logarithmic scale. So you can see that the tick marks are equally spaced, but they're equally spaced based on powers of 10. So number of survivors, 1, 10, 100, 1,000. And then on the horizontal axis, the age of those organisms. So mortality rates tend to follow one of three patterns that are shown on this graph. High to low. So very high mortality at young ages, and then low mortality at advanced ages. And that's considered type 3. There's also steady mortality, where the mortality of members of a population is generally consistent throughout their age. And this is considered type 2. And then finally, low to high. So low mortality at young ages, but then higher mortality at higher ages. This is a type 1 curve. You can see, this can be represented by humans. So where organisms fall on these patterns of mortality, like which curve they fall on as a survivorship curve, depends on the number of offspring they produce and parenting behavior. You can see silhouettes of different organisms on this graphic. So it's possible to predict the number of offspring and parenting styles for each curve. So what you should do is pause the video here, or in a moment, pause the video. For each of these creatures, write down the number of offspring they have, like small, medium, large number of offspring, and then their parenting styles. Do they offer a lot of parenting, a little bit of parenting, or no parenting, like no care for the offspring? So why don't you write that down for type 1, type 2, type 3, pause the video, and then come back and restart it when you're ready to compare what I'm going to say to what you wrote down. So for type 1 organisms, these organisms have a small number of offspring. So consider for humans, in the US, humans will tend to have, anywhere from 1 to 3 offspring, although, some families have more, 4 or 5. I mean, it's still possible to hear of families with 6, 7, 8 children. But generally, overall, a small number of offspring. And then parenting styles, human parents offer a lot of care for their children, right? That you're really parenting till your children are in their teen years. I mean, legally, you're not allowed to let them go until they're 18. So that's a pretty large amount of parenting. You can compare that to a type 2 curve. So here we have some sort of hawk or an eagle. And so the animals, when they're in eggs, they're cared for a little bit. But even sometimes, animals don't survive to hatch. They'll hatch, and the parents will take care of them for a certain amount of time. They'll feed them and, help them to become more independent. But that happens relatively quickly, right? We're talking in terms of weeks or months in terms of birds. And then as they get older, they die off at, a pretty steady rate. So it's a moderate amount of offspring, right? Because they can have multiple offspring many times, and then moderate amount of parenting. And then finally are organisms that fall on the type 3 curve. So these are organisms that produce a lot of offspring. So for example, trees often produce a lot of seeds or nuts. For example, there's an acorn, right? Oak trees will produce, a huge number of acorns. But then they offer basically no parenting, right? Once the acorn is on the ground, it's on its own, and who knows whether it actually, gets into the soil in a way that will help it survive. So it experiences very high mortality um, early on, but then if the tree actually gets into the ground and survives, being a sapling, grows into a larger tree, then it's probably going to live for a long time. All right, well, those are the survivorship curves. You need to know which one's type 1, which one's type 3. Also, how these relate to K and R selected species, right? Where K selected species tend to be type 1 and R selected tend to be type 3. That's all for Unit 3.3. Please let me know what questions you have.